speaker, Michelle Bradac with A2LA. Michelle attended Towson State University, earning a bachelor's degree in biology, and attended Hood College, earning a master's certificate in regulatory compliance in biomedical science. She's worked for A2LA for 8 years, assisting in the accreditation of food testing, environmental testing, and cannabis testing laboratories to ISO IEC 17025, as well as performing quality system assessments. She's also facilitated a number of accreditation programs, including field sampling measurements organizations, STAC air emissions, and cannabis testing. Michelle is also a member of the ASTM Cannabis Working Group and the ACIL Cannabis Working Group. Without further ado, Michelle, you have the ring.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that. I'm going to jump right into my presentation today. Just as he noted, we're from A2LA. We're an accrediting body here in the U.S., accrediting cannabis testing laboratories and lots of other different types of laboratories, proficiency testing providers, calibration laboratories, et cetera. As you all are probably well aware, in most states where cannabis has been legalized either for medical or recreational use, there are accompanying regulatory requirements for testing, mostly to ensure safety and that the label claims are accurate. This hasn't always been the case, and over the years, the cannabis testing space has changed drastically. So today, I'm going to discuss a couple of different items, starting with the evolution of the state testing regulations. I'll give a brief overview of 17025 accreditation, how this fits into the industry, discuss common issues and hurdles that laboratories are facing, getting started and getting accredited. I'll discuss how accreditation can help with consistency among laboratories and in the industry, and how accreditation can benefit others in the industry. This is just a quick visual representation showing which states have legalized cannabis for adult use, which is in dark green, for medical use in the light green, and CBD only in those states that are gray. So while I'm going to focus mainly on testing within the United States today, I'd like to also note that accreditation of testing laboratories, it extends worldwide and is recognized by many different economies, including maybe potentially Canada, Europe, et cetera. What makes this industry different than many other regulated industries is the federal illegality of the substance. This presents a unique challenge among states in that they must act as the regulatory agency in setting the rules, which in turn has created a regulatory inconsistency across the country. One inconsistency that can be seen between states is the quality management system requirements for testing laboratories. As you can see on the left, the early adopting states relied mainly on systems that were already being used in their state in some way, such as ORLAP, which is the Oregon Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program. New York uses their Environmental Laboratory Approval Program, while others have made no mention to any sort of quality system requirement, such as Alaska. More recently, on the right side of the page, you can see that the newly adopting states are requiring 17025 as a quality system standard, which is generally a condition of state recognition. And those that I've listed there, most of the ones that have accepted it as of the date of this presentation. However, there are more in the works. And this is just a quick visual representation of the states that are actually requiring or recommending 17025 accreditation of the testing laboratories. And as I mentioned, we expect this number to rise as more states allow the use of medical or recreational marijuana. So what is 17025? 17025 is a standard developed by the International Organization for Standardization, which specifies the general requirements for the competence of testing and calibration laboratories. It's similar in the quality management principles to ISO 9001, which some of you may have heard of. However, 17025 adds a technical aspect, which allows for laboratories to also be assessed and deemed technically competent for the testing activities they perform. Accreditation bodies provide a scope of accreditation, which is a document that details the activities for which the laboratory has been deemed technically competent. There are some testing laboratories out there that perform a variety of tests, but we actually go in and issue this scope of accreditation for the tests that we have actually observed them performing. This standard is one that has been used in various industries such as food, environmental, pharmaceutical, electrical, and mechanical industries. So how do you choose an accrediting body and evaluate their competence to accredit testing laboratories? The use of accreditation bodies that are signatories to the ILAC, which is the International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation Mutual Recognition Arrangement, provides a high level of confidence in the accreditation body's competence. This is based on the requirement for the accreditation body to undergo routine, vigorous peer evaluations against long-standing international standards for assessing quality and are regulated themselves. All accreditation bodies that are part of ILAC must comply with ISO 17011, which is the general requirements for accreditation bodies accrediting conformity assessment bodies. You can find additional information about this recognition and which accreditation bodies are recognized at www.ilac.org. To give you an idea of other industries that also recognize 17025 as a standard for competence, I've listed a few that you may be familiar with. In the forensics area, there's the National DNA Index System, NDIS, recognizes HLA as an accrediting agency. The EPA and DoD also recognize 17025, as well as their own program-specific requirements for accreditation. The FCC, whose symbol you find on many electronics, your phone, your mouse, they also recognize 17025 for laboratories testing their approved products. Some others you may recognize are the National Animal Health Laboratory Network, Food and Pharmaceutical FDA, CPSC, which is the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and EPA Energy Star. So as you can see, there's a lot of industries that accept 17025 as a basis for testing. So what is 17025 in a nutshell? It's essentially a mechanism to ensure that the laboratory says what they do what they say, and they have the records to prove it. Essentially, the standard requires documentation of policies and procedures, training and implementation of those policies and procedures, and records to prove it. And this doesn't just involve the quality system aspects in terms of documentation, but also for testing. The basis of the standard is having a documented quality management system, which is implemented in all aspects of testing. Some of the quality system aspects are having a system for document control and documenting procedures for purchasing and receiving samples, equipment and services, complaints, both internal and external, non-conforming work, and corrective actions to address the non-conforming work. Also internal audits and management reviews, as well as procedures and processes for controlling records. And these are just a few of the quality management system aspects of the standard. ISO 17025 also takes into account the technical competence of the laboratory, and there are many areas that are assessed specific to each type of test that they perform, such as training of personnel, the validation of methods, sampling, either sampling at the customer site or subsampling once they receive a sample at the laboratory, uncertainty of the measurement, control of data, equipment maintenance and calibration, the traceability of the measurement, quality control activities, and reporting of the data. These aspects are assessed not only in terms of an overarching procedure or process, but to ensure that those are the appropriate for each test that the laboratory is accredited to perform. So why is the standard important in the cannabis industry? As you saw on an earlier slide, there's an inconsistent approach by states in regulating the testing laboratories and ensuring their competence. The standard provides a basis of competence between testing laboratories and can also provide this between states. The standard requirements for record and data control and traceability allow for increased data defensibility. Accreditation bodies require proficiency testing or interlaboratory comparison testing when available, which can create greater consistency and comparability between laboratories. It also provides accountability via the third-party audit by trained and qualified technical experts. And lastly, the accreditation provides continued oversight as the laboratories are assessed on an ongoing basis. We're going to begin to talk about some common issues and hurdles faced by new and established laboratories in the cannabis industry. Most states have specific testing requirements such as potency, cannabinoid content, pesticide analysis, residual solvents, heavy metals, moisture analysis, and testing for microbiological contaminants. There are very few states such as Arizona and Washington, D.C. that currently have no specific requirements for testing in terms of the types of tests they have to perform, if any. And while states typically define the requirements, customers may still request additional testing to make specific label claims. One unique challenge that states face is who to task with the sampling activities. Earlier adopters generally allow the growers and cultivators to provide samples for testing. However, they're faced with the uncertainty of how representative the sample is of the entire batch. More recently, the states are beginning to adopt the requirement for an independent third party to perform sampling, or that at the very least have stated requirements for sampling that the grower or cultivator must meet. States such as Oregon and Maryland have very specific sampling requirements developed by the states, and states such as Florida, Illinois, and Maryland also require a third party, often a laboratory, to perform the sampling. And just as a side note, the 17025 standard does take into account sampling activities. So why is sampling so important? The laboratory analysis and essentially the product label claims relies on the sampling to characterize a larger batch. Hence, the process of collecting a representative sample in the beginning of the process is very important. Most importantly, the sampling activities must ensure that the sample is homogeneous and that it is representative of the entire batch. The sampling methods must be applied with consistency, and the practices and equipment used must be appropriate for the matrix. ISO 17025 takes into account these sampling activities. It can also be applied solely to an organization performing only sampling activities. So there is the allowance for a company to perform only sampling. The laboratory doesn't necessarily have to do this themselves. There are many items that constitute an appropriate sampling plan. Some aspects are the use of appropriate equipment, for example, calibrated balances and appropriate sample containers. This would also include reagents used to clean the equipment used to take the sample. The sample should be randomly selected from different locations within a container or a set of containers, and the procedures should be developed to describe how the samples are taken. The sampling plan should include information on how a statistically valid sample size is determined. The number and types of tests to be performed on the sample also play a role in determining the sample size. This information is sometimes specified by the states as a minimum, but they may need to be calculated by the sampler depending on the batch size. The sampling plan should also take into account the chain of custody and all of the identifying information for the sample taken and the sampler. The sample handling is also an important aspect, such as the appropriate environmental conditions in which the sample should be kept. And these are just some of the areas to take into account when developing a sampling plan that can really affect the result of the test and how appropriate it is to be representative of that entire batch. One of the biggest challenge laboratories face is the selection of and validation of methods to perform the required testing. As you heard from Jeff earlier, there are currently no standard validated methods available for use in cannabis. Some states reference standard methods that are used in other matrices, such as food, hops, and tobacco. Even still, many states are mute as to any recommendation of methods, leaving the decision of the best equipment and method to use up to the laboratories. The allowable limits of certain analytes of interest, for example, pesticides, may be extremely small, which eliminates some of the common methods used to detect pesticides in other industries. There we go. So why is method validation so important? To analyze the product, the laboratories need to ensure that the appropriate method of analysis has been validated as being capable of detecting and quantifying the level of analysis of interest, and that it has also been shown effective in the expected matrices. When is method validation necessary? In this industry, almost always, at this point in time, at least. Laboratories developing their own internal methods must validate those methods before the initial use. It's also necessary when transferring that same validated method to another laboratory location, for example, if a satellite location is opened in another town or another state. It's also necessary when any parameters or matrices or analytes have changed. And lastly, anytime a method is modified for use in cannabis, it must also be validated. For example, a method that was validated for use for pesticide analysis in hops may be appropriate, but would first need to be validated for use in cannabis. Some of the typical method validation performance characteristics are accuracy, precision, repeatability, specificity, quantitation limits, linearity, and range. The process of determining the characteristics provides documented evidence that the method does what it's intended to do. Unfortunately, this presentation would need to be quite a bit longer if I were to get into the specifics of how to determine the characteristics. However, there are some very helpful resources available out there to explain these in additional detail. Some of these are the AOAC validation requirements for dietary supplements and botanicals, and the ICHQ2 validation of analytical procedures. So in this industry, information related to how a method can be modified or validated is often not shared, as you guys had heard earlier from Jeff. So essentially, you have almost every laboratory running a slightly different method in some way. Method validation helps ensure that some sort of consistency as the aspects are taken into account for each validation or reviewed for each type of test the laboratory is accredited to perform. In states where there is not yet product to test, this creates a unique challenge to get the methods validated so that testing can begin when the product is available. We do something in place where we have an option to validate a method using reference standards that can be purchased from certified reference material producers. This provides enough information for an initial validation in time to get accredited, and a full validation could then be completed once the product is available. Many of the aforementioned issues, sampling, method selection, method validation, they can create inconsistency among labs. So how do you alleviate this? One way is proficiency testing. Proficiency testing is the evaluation of participant performance against pre-established criteria by means of inter-laboratory comparisons. Essentially, this is the comparison of measured results from different laboratories. This can provide information to the laboratory as to the performance of their methods, as well as to have insight to internal issues with testing, such as out-of-tolerance equipment, training issues, et cetera. Accrediting bodies require laboratories with a high Z-score in the proficiency testing to perform corrective actions and determine the reason for the out-of-tolerance result. And if subsequent performance continues to show the same issues, the testing would be removed from their scope of accreditation until it can be shown that their results are within tolerance. In an industry where many different methods are used, this can help ensure that at the very least, the results of those methods are statistically relevant. And as a side note, proficiency testing is starting to be required by some states, and we do see it being added as part of the draft regulations as well. Now that I've gone over some of the issues of testing and how accreditation can alleviate or create consistency, I'd like to go over some specific information about the process of accreditation. So first, the laboratory would submit an application to the accrediting body, which includes documentation such as a copy of their quality manual and SOPs, list of equipment used for the testing, a list of tests that they would like to be accredited to perform, as well as some other items. Once the application is complete, an assessor would be assigned to perform the assessment. The assessment is typically completed within 60 days of the assignment, and a report is left with the laboratory detailing any nonconformances. New laboratories are allowed up to 4 months to completely respond to all of the nonconformances and correct them. Existing laboratories, which we call renewal laboratories, have up to 60 days to provide a response to those nonconformances. Once the deficiencies are corrected and they have been reviewed by first HLA staff, the technical assessor, and then eventually our accreditation council, accreditation is granted. The typical process for from the date the complete application is submitted, meaning all of the additional documentation, quality manual, SOPs, et cetera, until accreditation is granted, is typically 4 to 7 months. This can be vastly shortened depending on how quickly the laboratory would need to get accredited, or it may take some laboratories up to a year or more for the process to take place. Once the accreditation is granted, it's valid for 2 years. AHPA specifically does following the initial assessment, they must undergo a short 1-day surveillance visit, which is where we check the implementation of their quality system and check all of the corrective actions that stemmed from the initial assessment and make sure that those corrective actions have continued to be effective. Following that surveillance assessment, the on-site assessment occurs every 2 years, and on the off year, we perform what we call an annual review, where we just ask the laboratory to submit some documentation related to their most recent internal audit and management review. But in that sense, we don't come back on site. So every 2 years, we're on site to review the actual testing activities. So for new laboratories that are preparing for initial accreditation, the task can seem somewhat daunting. I've summarized some items here to take into account when preparing for accreditation. This step of the process would typically occur once you have the laboratory location, you've purchased equipment, hired staff, et cetera. At the point where you have a quality system maybe already in place where you're developing that quality system. If you're brand new, writing the quality system would essentially be the first step. Using the standard, you can use the standard as a guide, and it's helpful to ensure that all of the required aspects are taken into account. If you already have a quality system in place or you have a laboratory that's already been doing testing in another area, it's helpful to perform a gap analysis to determine if there's any areas that need to be addressed before submitting an application. The performance of method validation is also very important in this industry, as it must be completed before we can grant accreditation for the methods on your scope. It's also helpful to go ahead and enroll and participate in proficiency testing if it's available. Each accreditation body is different. However, AHLA requires participation in at least one activity before accreditation can be granted. Ensuring that the equipment is appropriately calibrated and verified is also important. Accreditation bodies are required to develop a traceability policy which details specifics regarding how to achieve traceability of the equipment used for testing. And of course, you want to ensure that you have staff that are trained and authorized to perform the testing on your scope of accreditation. There must be at least one trained and authorized personnel for each method in your scope before we can grant accreditation. Another available tool that may be helpful in preparation for accreditation is training. We offer many training courses specific to the cannabis industry, different standards, and quality system aspects. The applicable quality system trainings include just our general 17025 accreditation. We have an advanced course that goes a little beyond the basics of 17025, and we also have a cannabis-specific track which focuses on method validation, sampling, and some other aspects. There's also some additional training that we offer in areas such as documenting your quality system, internal auditing, root cause analysis and corrective action, measurement uncertainty, method validation, and statistics. And these training courses are typically offered in our home office in Frederick, Maryland, but we do offer quite a few throughout the U.S., so you're welcome to visit our website at any time and see where these are being offered. As previously mentioned, 17025 is applied across many industries, and the standard itself is written in a way to be able to be applicable to various industries. As such, there are many industries that are specific requirements that they feel must be taken into account to ensure the competence of the laboratory and validity of the test result. Most accreditation bodies offer specific programs that, as an add-on on top of 17025, to account for those areas of concern. For example, the SEC, DOD, and the EPA, they all have additional programs that have some sort of additional requirements for their testing. AHLA has added a voluntary set of additional requirements that are specific to cannabis testing laboratories in partnership with Americans for Safe Access. ASA has agreed to recognize the accreditation to these additional requirements as a means to also obtain their ASA PFC certification for laboratories. The requirements for this additional program are based on the American Herbal Products Association, AHPA, recommendations for regulators for cannabis laboratory operations. AHPA developed these recommendations in 2010 with an express purpose to address the issues related to the cannabis operations. These recommendations already included many aspects that were actually already developed by the 17025 standard. However, it also takes into account areas of concern specific to the industry. And some of these that I've listed below are security, the chain of custody of the sample, sampling, method validation, training, good documentation practices, and data collection. So why is accreditation so important to the cannabis industry as a whole? It benefits growers by allowing them to identify a competent testing laboratory. It allows them to have confidence in the test results and gives them the confidence in the defensibility of the data provided by the laboratory to constitute the label claims and claims that the product meets the allowable limits that are set forth by the states for pesticides, microbiological contaminants, heavy metals, et cetera. It can benefit the states because the state regulatory agencies could maintain the oversight and the ownership of their individual programs. However, they can delegate the responsibility to ensure compliance to a third party such as AHPA or another accrediting body, while still maintaining the ownership and the final approval of the laboratories. And lastly, the patients and users have greater confidence in the label claims of their cannabis products because of the accuracy and quality of the tests performed. Public oversight of the third-party assessment activities also provides greater transparency, and it provides the opportunity to observe how the regulatory agency achieves its objectives. So in conclusion, accreditation can help create and maintain consistency. Laboratories are assessed to the same requirements with the same level of rigor, and it takes into account appropriate methods of analysis, traceability, participation in proficiency testing, and ensures that there's a representative sample. And again, it can create consistency amongst the test labs. It can also create consistency among states because you're applying the same basis of quality management system amongst different laboratories in different states. And it also has a third-party oversight. So every 2 years, you do have somebody coming in and ensuring that that laboratory continues to meet those same quality objectives. So that's it for my presentation today. I've listed my contact information here, and then I'll go to another slide next real quick. This is just general information for A2LA. Our website's listed there. There's a general info email if you just want to send a general inquiry, but feel free to use my contact information here if you have any specific questions about the program.